Well, I think they know we've seen each other before, dear. Why don't you just take a couple of deep breaths and try and relax and pretend you're in Lamaze class or something.
Some love stories don't end with a clean break. They transform, linger, and quietly shape everything that comes after. For Don Johnson, one relationship stands above all the rest. Not because it lasted forever, but because it didn't. Despite moving on, building a family, and creating a life far removed from old headlines, there's a connection from his past that still carries undeniable weight. Friends close to the actor say the bond never truly disappeared. And now, in a rare moment of honesty, Johnson has named the one woman he regrets losing. And the truth behind that admission is more complicated than anyone imagined. The secret struggles behind early stardom. The story begins in Flat Creek, Missouri, where Don Johnson was born to a teenage mother and a father barely out of his teens himself. Looking back, he would later describe his childhood as a contradiction. On the surface, it felt interesting, even idyllic. But underneath that calm, there was something darker. He's been open about how his parents' absence and abuse left him with a deep sense of abandonment that followed him for years. His father struggled to make a living as a farmer in Missouri, a failure that eventually pushed the family to start over in Wichita, Kansas. There, his dad found steady work at Boeing and quickly moved up the ladder while his mother supported the family as a beautician. Johnson would later say that whatever drive he had came directly from watching them work. They showed him how to grind, even when the odds weren't great. Still, that Boeing job didn't mean comfort. Johnson and his 3 younger siblings were packed into a tiny one-bathroom house in the projects. Housing originally built for employees, but far from glamorous. By his own account, they were still very poor. The real weight of his upbringing, though, wasn't physical hardship. It was emotional. He later explained that the struggle was psychological, something he didn't fully understand at the time. Years later, he'd come to see that tension as the very thing that pushed him forward, the spark that fueled his creativity. Everything shifted when he was 11 and his parents divorced. He stayed with his mother at first, but the situation quickly spiraled. She couldn't control him, and Johnson was already acting out, pushing boundaries wherever he could. Before long, his behavior landed him in serious trouble, bad enough to put him in front of a juvenile court judge. The ruling was simple. He needed a change of environment. The judge sent him to live with his father. That move changed everything. Living with his dad introduced him to a different kind of life, one built around hunting, fishing, and time outdoors. Years later, Johnson would look back on that period and call it magical. For the first time, there was structure and there was connection. But there was also responsibility. As the oldest child, he felt the pressure to help provide for the family, a burden that weighed heavily on someone still in his teens. By 16, it all became too much. Johnson hit a breaking point and walked away from a home life that felt hopeless. He struck out on his own, carrying with him the belief that those harsh early years had shaped him into something tougher. And it was a good thing they had, because what lay ahead would demand every ounce of resilience he had. After pushing his way through high school and graduating in 1967, Johnson set his sights on acting, enrolling in the theater program at the University of Kansas. It might sound like the start of a smooth rise, but it wasn't. He dropped out after just 1 year. Still, quitting school didn't mean quitting the dream. Instead, he took a bigger leap. He headed west to San Francisco and enrolled at the American Conservatory Theater. It turned out to be a smart move. Being closer to Los Angeles meant being closer to opportunity, and that closeness paid off quickly. By 1970, Johnson landed his first film role in The Magic Garden of Stanley Sweetheart. At the time, he felt confident, even proud. He was starring in a film produced by Martin Pohl, an Academy Award nominee, and to a young actor trying to break in, that felt like validation. For a brief moment, Johnson believed he had arrived. The hard years seemed to be behind him, and the future looked wide open. But that sense of triumph wouldn't last long. A harsh reality was waiting, and it was about to bring him back down to earth fast. Hollywood's dangerous early love story. By 1970, Don Johnson had finally cracked the door to Hollywood. But getting inside was another story entirely. He stayed busy, landing roles in films like Zachariah, The Harrod Experiment, and Return to Macon County. On paper, it looked like progress. In reality, none of it was pushing him toward real stardom. The big breakout he'd imagined simply wasn't happening. He was working, but he was stuck. It was a frustrating stretch defined by effort without reward. The movies came and went, barely making a dent, yet one of those forgettable projects would end up changing his life in a way that had nothing to do with box office numbers or career momentum. During the filming of The Harrod Experiment, Johnson met Melanie Griffith, the daughter of his co-star, Tippi Hedren. The situation was complicated from the start. Johnson was 22. Griffith was just 14. Even in the anything-goes atmosphere of 1970s Hollywood, the age gap raised eyebrows. Still, the connection between them was undeniable, and once it sparked, it moved fast. Their first real interaction felt like something straight out of a movie script. While the crew prepared the next shot, Johnson and Griffith found themselves killing time together in a stairwell at the old Anheuser-Busch estate. It started as casual conversation, nothing serious on the surface, but for Griffith, it was instant. She later recalled being completely struck by him, seeing him as the most beautiful person she had ever laid eyes on. Adding another layer to the story, the set itself was practically a family affair. Griffith wasn't just visiting. She was acting in the film alongside her famous mother. It didn't take long for Hedren to sense that something unusual was happening. She later described both Johnson and her daughter as wonderful people, but she could also see that Melanie was behaving differently, in a way she never had before. To anyone paying attention, it was clear that emotions were getting involved. Johnson, for his part, never forgot their first meeting. Even though Griffith was technically just an extra at the time, she immediately stood out to him. He saw her as unusually sharp and mature, more so than women he had dated in the past. Still, he hesitated. He questioned whether pursuing the relationship was a good idea at all. That hesitation didn't last long. Before he knew it, Johnson found himself in a situation that felt surreal even to him, picking up his girlfriend from high school. He later admitted it felt strange waiting outside the school gates, fully aware of how unusual it looked. But that phase didn't last long. At just 15, Griffith was expelled from her Catholic school, reportedly for challenging religious teachings. Instead of returning home, she moved directly into a Hollywood rental with Johnson. From the outside, it may have looked like they were settling into life together. Behind the scenes, though, the relationship was already volatile. They lived together for several years before finally splitting up in 1975, but the separation didn't stick. About a year later, everything imploded in dramatic fashion. Johnson was out one night with former Miss World Marjorie Wallace when he received a call from Griffith in the early hours of the morning. According to Johnson, the conversation quickly turned emotional, with both of them declaring their love. By morning, they were on a plane to Las Vegas. Before the day was over, they were married. The impulsive reunion didn't bring stability. The renewed passion burned out almost immediately. Griffith later explained that the marriage wasn't born from happiness but desperation. The relationship wasn't working, yet they felt unable to walk away. Johnson later admitted he rushed into it, revealing that just the night before the wedding, he'd been spending time with Wallace and only left after receiving Griffith's call. It was messy, unhealthy, and clearly unsustainable. As chaotic as his personal life had become, Johnson's career was finally showing signs of life. In 1975, he starred in the cult film A Boy and His Dog, a role that earned him the Saturn Award for Best Actor the following year. He even shared the honor with James Caan, a major validation for an actor who had spent years stuck on the sidelines. The performance didn't come easily. The film required Johnson to act opposite a telepathic dog, meaning much of his work depended on improvisation and imagination. His biggest challenge was making the invisible feel real, convincing audiences that the connection actually existed. Critics bought it, and the praise was real. But the success came with a cost. Johnson later admitted the sudden attention unsettled him deeply. He wasn't prepared for recognition or expectation, and the pressure quickly became overwhelming. Instead of grounding him, the acclaim pushed him further off balance. By the late 1970s, he was leaning heavily on alcohol and drugs to cope. What started as partying turned into dependence, then addiction. Johnson later described his mindset at the time as reckless and extreme, driven by a desire to go as hard as possible the moment the camera stopped rolling. Eventually, the lifestyle stopped feeling fun and started feeling like a trap. And the truth was, he wasn't just trapped by addiction. Another, even bigger trap was quietly forming, one that would soon threaten to take everything from him. The risk that revived his career. After separating from Melanie Griffith, Don Johnson didn't exactly retreat into solitude. Between 1976 and 1980, his personal life moved just as fast as his career stalled, cycling through relationships with Lynn Whitfield, Tanya Tucker, and Sally Sheridan in quick succession. It was restless, unfocused, and far from permanent. Johnson wasn't looking to settle down. He was still drifting. That drift finally slowed in 1981 when he met Patty D'Arbanville. Their first encounter was anything but ordinary. Johnson was in New York filming a movie and decided to stop by Andy Warhol's factory. When he walked in, he found Patty standing naked on a table, in the middle of a photo shoot for the very first cover of Interview magazine. The image stopped him cold. She was magnetic. Even then, nothing happened right away. It wasn't until they ran into each other again at a restaurant in Los Angeles that the connection truly ignited. Johnson arrived at dinner with his girlfriend at the time, Tanya Tucker, but he left with Patty. By the end of the night, Patty had moved in. Johnson later joked that they barely left the bed for days, relying on his house staff to bring them food and water. Unlike his previous relationships, this one changed his life in a lasting way. Patty became pregnant with Johnson's first child, Jessie. She made it clear she was keeping the baby, and although they chose not to marry legally, becoming a father forced Johnson to confront himself in ways he never had before. That didn't mean he suddenly became stable. Johnson was still spiraling, and the weight of his addictions pushed Patty to the edge. She later described him as a beautiful and talented man who was completely out of control. For her, leaving felt inevitable. But just before she walked away, Johnson did something unexpected. He admitted he needed help and committed to changing. Skepticism was natural. Johnson had promised change before. This time, though, it stuck. He entered rehab, and against all expectations, the process went smoothly. Patty's own experience with recovery helped guide him, but even she was stunned when he kicked his habits in just 45 days. To both of them, it felt like a miracle. Still, sobriety didn't fix everything. Johnson's career was barely breathing. Even as he cleaned up his personal life, he privately worried that Hollywood had already moved on without him. Auditions came and went, but casting directors no longer saw him as a leading man. Some even compared his presence to a relief pitcher, someone brought in only when better options were exhausted. By the early 1980s, his 1976 acting award felt like a fluke, a distant reminder of what might have been. He spent years grinding through television work with little to show for it. Then, in 1984, everything changed. That year, Johnson landed the role of Sonny Crockett on Miami Vice, the part that would redefine his life. Ironically, he nearly passed it up. When his agent called to tell him to fly to Los Angeles for the audition, Johnson was out sail fishing in Florida. At first, he refused. He didn't want to leave the water. After heated back and forth with his agent, he finally agreed to go. That decision saved his career. What made the casting even more surprising was that NBC already knew him well, not for success, but for failure. Johnson had starred in several unsuccessful pilots for the network. Those projects hadn't gone anywhere, but they had introduced him to NBC executive Brandon Tartikoff, who remembered him. When Miami Vice came together, that familiarity worked in Johnson's favor. Once the show aired, Johnson didn't just become a star. He became a cultural icon. Miami Vice stood apart from other gritty crime shows of the era because of its look and attitude, much of which came directly from Johnson. His permanent stubble wasn't accidental. It was meant to suggest a man who lived undercover, slept in his clothes, and never truly shut off. Maintaining it required trimming rather than shaving, just to keep the effect right. Then there was the wardrobe. Light-colored blazers with rolled-up sleeves, pastel t-shirts underneath, loafers with no socks. What looked like high fashion was actually practical. The jacket hid a holster. The missing socks were simply a response to Miami heat. Still, the look caught fire. Men everywhere tried to copy it. Almost overnight, Johnson's fame exploded worldwide. Critics and cultural commentators praised his effortless confidence, and he quickly became the face of cool in the Reagan era. But the success didn't make him complacent. Knowing how easily it could all disappear, Johnson threw himself into the role. He trained obsessively, cleaned up his diet, and became deeply involved in shaping Sonny Crockett's personality and image. Off-screen, his intensity didn't slow down. Johnson lived impulsively, guided by instinct rather than planning. He once flew to Mexico on a whim just because he wanted authentic food. That same restless energy carried into his creative ambitions. In 1986, at the height of Miami Vice, he released a solo album, Heartbeat, and even performed one of its songs on the show. As always, his love life complicated everything. In 1987, at a Christmas party filled with Hollywood royalty, Johnson met Barbra Streisand. The two connected immediately. Within a month, they went public, not at a glamorous gala, but at a heavyweight boxing match. It was an unconventional debut for an unconventional pairing. Together, they were a true power couple. Both were massive stars, both strong-willed, and both accustomed to control. Many felt the relationship was doomed from the start. The press described them as having two of the biggest egos in the business. Still, Streisand committed fully. She defended Johnson fiercely, dismissed criticism of his past, and even tried to keep pace with his hard-living lifestyle. For the first time, Johnson had someone powerful standing between him and the world. But history has a way of repeating itself. Johnson reconnected with Melanie Griffith while helping her enter rehab, and that single meeting reopened everything they thought they had left behind. Griffith, fresh off the success of Working Girl, was unraveling privately as her marriage collapsed and her addictions worsened. Old emotions resurfaced quickly. Once Griffith's marriage ended, she and Johnson decided to try again. They believed their bond had never truly broken, only paused. Compared to that pull, his relationship with Streisand faded quickly. It ended in under a year. Johnson later spoke kindly of Streisand, crediting her with expanding his perspective and challenging him intellectually. But it was clear his heart had already chosen its direction. The hidden struggles behind the spotlight. By early 1989, Don Johnson and Melanie Griffith were giving their relationship another chance. And for the second time, they were walking down the aisle together. The wedding was small and intimate, with only a few dozen guests, but everything about it felt hopeful. They both wore white, and to those in attendance, they looked genuinely happy, as if all the chaos behind them had finally led to this moment. In the months leading up to the ceremony, Melanie made it clear why this reunion felt different. Time apart, hard lessons, and years of struggle had changed them both. No matter how far they drifted, they had stayed connected, bound by something neither of them could fully explain. This time, the relationship felt like a fresh start, but also like the continuation of a story that had never truly ended. For Melanie, Don had been her first great love, and that bond never really disappeared. And surprisingly, the years that followed turned out to be the best chapter of their long, complicated history. For the first time in years, both Don and Melanie were sober, grounded, and fully present. Their careers were thriving, but more importantly, their focus had shifted toward family. Even before the wedding, they had already stepped away from the Hollywood spotlight, splitting their time between Melanie's home in Miami and Don's ranch in Aspen. Eventually, Aspen became home. They didn't just change locations, they changed lifestyles. The parties and excess faded into the background. The kids were enrolled in private school, charity events filled their calendar, and mornings were more likely spent jogging or golfing than recovering from the night before. It was a complete reversal from the lives they once lived. Just before the wedding, they shared even bigger news. They were expecting a child together. Later that year, Melanie gave birth to their daughter, Dakota Johnson. At the time, no one could have known she'd grow up to become a star herself. But for Don and Melanie, her arrival felt like a reward, a sign that they had finally made it through the worst of their demons. Don openly embraced fatherhood again, describing how much clearer life felt when he was sober. Melanie, according to her mother Tippi Hedren, was happier than she had ever been. This was something she had wanted from the very beginning, a family with the man she had loved since she was young. Dakota was born on October 4, 1989, making that year one of the most significant of Don Johnson's life. But while his personal life was reaching a high point, his professional life was entering a turning phase. After years of living inside the skin of Sonny Crockett, Don realized there was nowhere left to take the character. The role had given him everything, but it had also taken its toll. By 1989, he felt exhausted and creatively spent. He stepped away from Miami Vice knowing the decision was necessary, even if it meant walking away from the role that made him a global icon. The problem was, Sonny Crockett didn't walk away from him. As Don tried to separate himself from the character, his real life began to mirror the excess of the role even more closely. He poured money into boats, cars, luxury homes, a private jet, and a sprawling ranch. From the outside, it looked like success on an almost absurd scale. Inside, something was missing. Despite fame, wealth, and a growing family, Don felt deeply unhappy. He later admitted that all the spending was an attempt to fill an emptiness he didn't know how to confront. The lifestyle didn't fix anything, it only distracted him temporarily. Even though he had cleaned up enough to reclaim his career, sobriety was never a straight line. Over the years, Don slipped in and out of old habits, struggling quietly with alcohol and drugs. He later described those periods as some of the darkest of his life, moments when simply existing felt heavy. Still, one thing never changed: his professionalism. No matter what was happening behind the scenes, Don showed up for work. On the set of Harley-Davidson and The Marlboro Man in 1991, when co-star Mickey Rourke failed to show up for a scheduled test, Don didn't explode or walk out. Instead, he handled it directly, and the two ended up developing a surprisingly easy working relationship. That same professionalism carried over into his work with Melanie. The couple starred together in Paradise in 1991 and Born Yesterday in 1993. Don later described the experience as ideal, working side by side during the day, then going home together at night. For a while, it looked like they had finally found balance, but slowly the cracks returned. As the years passed, both Don and Melanie began to change in different directions. The passion that once pulled them back together again and again started to fade. Fans assumed it was just another rough patch. After all, this wasn't their first storm. But this time, something was different. By 1994, the strain was impossible to ignore. Don entered rehab again, this time battling alcohol and prescription drugs. Around them, everything felt like it was unraveling. Melanie had publicly admitted to her own relapse. Rumors swirled about Don fathering a child outside the marriage. An ill-advised radio interview only added fuel to the fire. Divorce speculation was everywhere, and this time, it stuck. Melanie filed for divorce in 1994. Though they briefly paused the process, the marriage officially ended in 1996. Melanie later spoke candidly about the split, acknowledging how difficult Don could be while also admitting how hard it was to imagine life without him. They weren't enemies, they were simply growing apart. That second divorce marked the true end of their romantic story. Even so, Don would later emphasize that they were forever connected through their daughter. The love had changed, but it hadn't vanished. A few years later, Don Johnson's life took a quieter turn. In 1999, he met Kelly Flager, a schoolteacher with no interest in Hollywood fame. She wasn't part of the celebrity world Don had spent decades orbiting, and that was exactly the point. When they married on April 29, 1999, it wasn't just another wedding, it was a reset. Don walked away from the excess. The drinking stopped. The fleet of cars disappeared. He later described his transformation as spiritual, the result of years spent breaking himself open, searching for something real beneath all the noise. The pain, the mistakes, the self-destruction, it all finally led somewhere meaningful. With Kelly, Don built the life he had been chasing for decades. They had 3 children together, and this time he was fully present. He focused on family, reconciliation, and living with intention. Being a father, not a leading man, became the role that mattered most. Reconnecting with his older children, Jesse and Dakota, grounded him even further. Watching Dakota rise to fame on her own terms filled him with pride, not because she was famous, but because she was fulfilled. After a lifetime of chaos, reinvention, and near misses, Don Johnson finally found what he had been searching for all along. Not another hit show, not another headline, just home. Don Johnson names the one woman that he regrets losing. In recent years, reports, most notably from In Touch, have suggested that Don Johnson and his ex-wife Melanie Griffith have grown noticeably close again. This isn't about romance or rekindling old flames. Johnson has been married to Kelly Flager since 1999 and remains committed to that life. But those close to the situation say his affection for Melanie has never faded, and given their shared history and their daughter, that connection was never going to disappear. At the center of it all is Dakota Johnson. Both parents are said to be immensely proud of her and her success, and that pride has naturally pulled them back into the same orbit. They've reportedly spent time together at Dakota's home in Malibu during family gatherings, keeping things relaxed and focused on what matters most. Johnson has also remained close to Melanie's mother, the iconic Tippi Hedren. In fact, he recently hinted at a new project by posting a photo with the now 94-year-old Hedren, calling her his beautiful co-star. Details were scarce, but the message was clear. They're still family in every way that counts. Even after Melanie moved on following their second divorce, those close to Johnson say his instinct to look out for her never went away. After decades of knowing each other, that sense of protectiveness feels almost automatic. He has especially been there for her through serious health struggles, offering steady support when she needed it most. Melanie's health journey has been a difficult one. She underwent surgery for skin cancer in 2009 and again years later to remove additional cancer from her face. On top of that, she has been open about living with epilepsy, a condition that went undiagnosed for years despite repeated warning signs. She later explained that her seizures were triggered by intense stress, including a frightening episode aboard a yacht near Cannes. During that incident, she suffered a severe seizure, was rushed to a hospital, returned to the boat, and then experienced another seizure almost immediately. Only after further testing was she finally diagnosed back in the United States, realizing she had been dealing with the condition for nearly 2 decades without proper answers. Today, Melanie appears to have her health under control and is navigating life on her own terms. According to sources, Johnson continues to be firmly in her corner. If and when she decides to start dating again, he's said to be more than willing to help, even playing matchmaker if that's what she wants. Her happiness, by all accounts, genuinely matters to him. What stands out most is how their relationship has evolved. After years of passion, chaos, heartbreak, and reconciliation, Don Johnson and Melanie Griffith seem to have landed in a place of real peace. No drama, no expectations, just mutual respect and lifelong friendship. It's not the ending anyone once imagined for them, but it may be the healthiest chapter they've ever shared.